My name is Sarah Mitchell, and I never imagined that accepting what seemed like my dream job would become the nightmare that nearly destroyed my life. 6 months ago, I was just another desperate college graduate with a business degree drowning in student debt and sending out resumes to anyone who would read them. I thought I was the luckiest girl in the world when I got hired at Mitchell & Associates, a small consulting firm downtown. The coincidence of the company sharing my last name felt like destiny. But destiny, as I learned, can be a cruel master. What started as an opportunity to build my career became a psychological prison that would eventually turn into a literal one. The man I thought was my mentor, my guide into the professional world, was actually a predator who had been planning something unspeakable from the moment he shook my hand in that interview room. I'm sharing this story not for sympathy, but because I know there are others out there who might be experiencing the same subtle signs I ignored, the same red flags I dismissed as just part of working for a demanding boss. What happened to me could happen to anyone, and it almost happened without a trace. If it weren't for one crucial mistake my captor made, I might not be here to tell this story at all. For 4 months, Robert Hendricks systematically broke down. My confidence isolated me from my coworkers and conditioned me to accept increasingly inappropriate treatment. He was methodical, patient, and terrifyingly intelligent in the way he manipulated every aspect of my work environment. By the time I realized what was happening, I was completely under his control, which made what came next possible. This is the story of how my boss locked me in the basement of our office building and left me there to die. This is the story of how I survived 5 days in captivity, discovered evidence of his other crimes, and ultimately watched him face justice in a courtroom. But most importantly, this is a story about recognizing the signs of workplace predators before it's too late. The nightmare began on a Tuesday morning in late October, but the seeds had been planted months earlier during what I thought was the best job interview of my life. Mr. Hendricks seemed like everything a young professional could want in a mentor: successful, charming, and genuinely interested in my development. His office was impressive, filled with awards and testimonials from satisfied clients, and he spoke with passion about building a family-oriented workplace. "Sarah," he said during that first meeting, his gray eyes fixed intently on mine, "I see something special in you. This isn't just a job opportunity. This is the beginning of what could be an incredible career. I'm personally going to make sure you succeed here." His words felt like validation after months of rejection letters and failed interviews. I left that meeting walking on air, convinced that my luck had finally changed. But luck, I would soon learn, had nothing to do with why Robert Hendricks hired me. I wasn't chosen for my qualifications or my potential. I was selected because I fit a very specific profile he was looking for. Young, naive, desperate for approval, socially isolated, and financially vulnerable. I was the perfect victim, and he knew it from the moment I walked into his office. The building where Mitchell & Associates operated should have been my first warning sign. It was an old converted warehouse in the industrial district, far from the bustling downtown business area where most consulting firms were located. The isolation wasn't accidental, it was strategic. Fewer people around meant fewer witnesses, and the thick concrete walls of the basement would soon become my prison. During my tour of the facility on my first day, Mr. Hendricks made sure to show me every corner of the building, including the basement storage area. "Every part of this business matters, Sarah," he explained, as we descended into the dimly lit lower level. "Sometimes you'll need to come down here to retrieve old files or supplies. It's all part of being thorough and professional." The basement felt cold and oppressive, but I attributed my discomfort to the stark fluorescent lighting and concrete walls. I remember looking around that basement and thinking how isolated it felt from the rest of the building. There were no windows, no second exit, and the thick walls seemed to swallow sound. When Mr. Hendricks closed the door behind us as we left, I heard the heavy click of the lock mechanism. Though I didn't think anything of it at the time, security was important in any business. After all, as we climbed back upstairs to the main office, Mr. Hendricks placed his hand on my shoulder in what seemed like a fatherly gesture. "You're going to do great things here, Sarah," he said, his voice warm and encouraging. "I have a very good feeling about you." At the time, his words filled me with confidence and determination. Looking back now, they sent chills down my spine. The other employees I met that day seemed professional but distant. There was Jessica, the office manager who had been there for 3 years, and Mark, a senior consultant who handled the bigger accounts. They were polite during introductions, but I noticed they didn't maintain eye contact for long and their smiles seemed forced. I assumed they were just busy with their work and would warm up to me once I proved myself. What I didn't realize was that Jessica and Mark had both learned through bitter experience to keep their distance from Mr. Hendricks' new hires. They had seen this pattern before. The excessive attention, the special treatment, the gradual isolation, and then the disappearance, but they were too afraid to warn me, too terrified of becoming targets themselves if they interfered with their boss's plans. That first day ended with Mr. Hendricks personally walking me to my car, making sure I felt appreciated and valued. "Welcome to the family, Sarah," he said as I unlocked my door. "I think we're going to accomplish great things together." As I drove home that evening, I felt more optimistic about my future than I had in months. I thought I had found not just a job, but a mentor who would help me build the career I had always dreamed of. I had no idea that I had just met the man who would become my captor, and that the basement he had so carefully shown me would soon become the scene of a crime that would change both our lives forever. The nightmare was about to begin, but first, he had to make me trust him completely. And unfortunately for me, Robert Hendricks was very, very good at earning trust right before he destroyed it. If I had known then what I know now, I would have run from that building and never looked back. But predators like Robert Hendricks are skilled at hiding their true nature until it's too late for their victims to escape. By the time I realized what he really was, I was already trapped in his web, and the only way out would be through the most terrifying experience of my life. This is where my story really begins, not with the imprisonment, but with the careful, methodical grooming that made it possible. Because understanding how I got there is just as important as understanding how I got out. Looking back, I should have known something was off about the job posting itself. It appeared on a Tuesday afternoon on 3 different job sites simultaneously, and by Thursday morning I had already received a call requesting an interview for Friday, in a job market where most companies took weeks to respond, if they responded at all. This kind of speed should have been a red flag, but I was so desperate for employment that I saw it as a miracle instead of a warning. I had been unemployed for 4 months since graduating with my business degree, and my savings account was down to double digits. My parents had made it clear that moving back home wasn't an option. They believed in tough love and thought I needed to figure things out on my own. My apartment lease was up for renewal in 6 weeks, and I was already 2 months behind on my student loan payments. The pressure was crushing, and I was willing to consider almost any legitimate job opportunity. The salary offered at Mitchell & Associates was $15,000 more than I had even dared to hope for as an entry-level employee. When I researched the company online, I found a professional website with testimonials from satisfied clients and photos of a successful growing business. What I didn't find was much specific information about the employees or the company's history, but the website looked legitimate, and the address was in a respectable part of town. I spent hours preparing for that interview, researching, consulting industry trends, and practicing answers to common interview questions. I bought a new blazer with money I couldn't afford to spend, got my hair professionally styled, and arrived at the building 15 minutes early. The converted warehouse looked modern and sophisticated from the outside, with large windows and contemporary signage that spelled out Mitchell & Associates in sleek metallic letters. The receptionist who greeted me was friendly but seemed nervous, constantly glancing toward the hallway that led to Mr. Hendricks' office. Her name was Lisa, and she had only been working there for 2 months. She explained while we waited for my appointment time, "Mr. H is really great to work for," she said. But something in her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as me. "He really cares about his employees' success." When Mr. Hendricks emerged from his office to collect me, I was immediately struck by his commanding presence. He was tall, probably 6'2", with graying hair and an expensive suit that fit him perfectly. His handshake was firm, his smile warm, and his eye contact steady and confident. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, as if my name carried special significance. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. Please, come in." His office was impressive in a way that spoke of success and stability. The mahogany desk was enormous, covered with neat stacks of important-looking documents. The walls were lined with framed certificates, awards, and photographs of Mr. Hendricks, shaking hands with what appeared to be prominent business leaders. Behind his desk, a large window offered a view of the city skyline, and I remember thinking that this was exactly the kind of office I hoped to have someday. The interview itself was unlike any I had experienced before. Instead of the typical barrage of technical questions and hypothetical scenarios, Mr. Hendricks seemed more interested in getting to know me personally. He asked about my family background, my living situation, my financial pressures, and my long-term career goals. At the time, I interpreted this personal attention as a sign that he cared about hiring someone who would be a good cultural fit for the company. "Tell me about your support system, Sarah," he said, leaning back in his leather chair. "Do you have family nearby, close friends, a boyfriend?" I explained that I was fairly isolated since graduating. Most of my college friends had moved away for jobs, I wasn't dating anyone seriously, and my family lived several states away. What I thought was just friendly conversation was actually him conducting reconnaissance. Identifying my vulnerabilities and isolation, he seemed particularly interested when I mentioned my financial struggles. Student loans are such a burden. For young people today, he said with apparent sympathy, I believe in paying people what they're worth. Sarah, if you're the right fit for this position, money won't be a concern for you. He quoted a salary figure that made my heart race with excitement. It was more than I had imagined possible for someone with my limited experience. The job description he outlined seemed perfect for someone trying to break into the consulting world. I would be working directly with him on client projects, gaining exposure to high-level business strategy, and receiving mentorship that would accelerate my career development. I don't just hire employees, Sarah, he explained. I invest in people's futures. The question is, are you someone worth investing in? When he asked if I had any questions, I inquired about the company culture and what a typical day might look like. His answers painted a picture of a close-knit workplace where everyone looked out for each other. We're not just colleagues here, he said. We're a team, and teams take care of their members. I personally make sure that everyone who works here has what they need to succeed. The interview concluded with him walking me through the office, introducing me to the few employees who were visible. Jessica, the office manager, gave me a brief smile and a quick handshake before returning to her computer screen. Mark, the senior consultant, was polite but seemed distracted, barely looking up from his paperwork. At the time, I assumed they were just busy professionals, focused on their work. As we passed through the main office area, I noticed how quiet it was. Despite there being several employees present, no one was talking, laughing, or engaging in the kind of casual interaction I had expected to see in a family-oriented workplace. The atmosphere felt tense, almost oppressive. But Mr. Hendrick's warm commentary about the company culture made me dismiss my instinctive concerns. The building tour included a quick walk through the break room, supply closet, and conference room before ending at the basement storage area. This might seem mundane, Mr. Hendrick said as we descended the concrete stairs, but organization and attention to detail are crucial in this business. Sometimes you'll need to retrieve old client files or archive documents from down here. It's all part of being thorough. The basement was exactly as I would later remember it during my imprisonment: cold, dimly lit, and completely isolated from the rest of the building. The walls were thick concrete, there were no windows, and the only light came from a single fluorescent fixture hanging from the ceiling. Filing cabinets lined the walls, and boxes of documents were stacked neatly in rows. It felt like a tomb. Though I tried to shake off that morbid impression, security is very important to us, Mr. Hendricks explained as we climbed back upstairs, making a point of locking the basement door behind us with a key he kept on a ring attached to his belt. We handle sensitive client information, so we can't have just anyone wandering around down there. Only senior staff members have access. The way he emphasized those words made me feel special, like I was being inducted into an exclusive club. By the time we returned to his office, I was completely sold on the opportunity. Mr. Hendricks seemed like the ideal mentor, successful, experienced, and genuinely interested in helping me develop my career. When he offered me the position at the end of our meeting, with a start date the following Monday, I accepted immediately, without even asking for time to consider it. Welcome to Mitchell & Associates, Sarah, he said, standing up to shake my hand once more. I have a very good feeling about this partnership. I think we're going to accomplish great things together. His grip was firm and confident, and his smile seemed genuine and warm. As I left the building that day, I felt like I was walking on air. I called my parents that evening to share the good news, and for the first time in months, they seemed proud of me. It sounds like you've found a real mentor, my mother said. Someone who recognizes your potential and is willing to invest in your future. That's exactly what you need at this stage of your career. Even my typically skeptical father seemed impressed by the salary and the opportunity for rapid advancement that weekend. I celebrated by buying groceries without checking my bank balance first and treating myself to dinner at a restaurant I had been avoiding due to cost. I felt like my life was finally turning around, like all the rejection letters and failed interviews had been leading up to this perfect opportunity. I spent Sunday evening planning my outfits for the first week and researching the consulting industry so I could hit the ground running. I had no idea that Mr. Hendricks had spent that same weekend preparing for my arrival in a very different way. While I was celebrating and planning for my bright future, he was setting up the systems and conditions that would eventually trap me in his web of control and abuse. The job I thought would save my life would nearly end it, and the man I saw as my salvation would become my captor. But on that sunny Friday afternoon, walking out of Mitchell & Associates with a signed job offer in my hand, I felt nothing but gratitude and excitement. I thought I had won the lottery. I had no way of knowing that I had actually just signed my own prison sentence. My first day at Mitchell & Associates began at 8 o'clock sharp on a Monday morning in early June. I had arrived 15 minutes early, partly from nervousness, and partly from excitement about starting what I believed would be the foundation of my career. The building looked different in the early morning light, more imposing somehow, with long shadows cast by the neighboring warehouses creating an almost industrial atmosphere that I hadn't noticed during my afternoon interview. Lisa, the receptionist, greeted me with what seemed like genuine warmth, though I noticed she kept her voice low as if afraid of being overheard. "Mr. H is already in," she whispered, nodding toward his office. "He's been here since 7. He wanted me to tell you to come straight to his office when you arrived." Her nervousness was palpable, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as we spoke, but I attributed it to typical first-day jitters on both our parts. Mr. Hendricks was waiting for me with a freshly brewed cup of coffee and a thick folder labeled Sarah Mitchell Orientation Materials. He seemed genuinely pleased to see me standing up from behind his massive desk to shake my hand with both of his. "Sarah, welcome to your first day. I hope you're ready to hit the ground running because we have some exciting projects lined up." For you, his enthusiasm was infectious, and I felt my confidence soar. The orientation process was more thorough than I had expected. Mr. Hendricks personally walked me through every aspect of the company's operations, from filing systems to client management protocols. He introduced me to software programs I had never used before, explained the intricacies of their project management system, and gave me detailed background information on their major clients. The attention to detail was impressive, and I felt grateful to be working for someone so organized and professional. What struck me most during those first few hours was how personally invested Mr. Hendricks seemed in my success. Unlike other bosses I had worked for during college internships, he didn't just dump a pile of tasks on my desk and walk away. Instead, he sat beside me as I learned new systems, patiently answering my questions and offering tips based on his years of experience. "I want you to feel completely confident in your abilities, Sarah," he said. "Your success is my success." The other employees were polite but distant during my first week. Jessica, the office manager, would smile and nod when we passed in the hallway, but our conversations never went beyond basic pleasantries about the weather or weekend plans. Mark, the senior consultant, was even more reserved, often seeming to avoid eye contact altogether when I tried to engage him in conversation during lunch breaks. I assumed they were just giving me space to settle in and would warm up once I proved myself. My initial assignments were varied and interesting, exactly the kind of work I had hoped to be doing. Mr. Hendricks had me researching industry trends for client presentations, analyzing financial data for strategic planning sessions, and even sitting in on phone calls with potential new clients. He would introduce me as his bright young associate and often asked for my input on decisions, making me feel valued and important in a way I had never experienced in previous jobs. The work environment itself seemed professional and well-organized. The office was quiet and focused, with everyone appearing to be deeply engaged in their projects. There were no obvious signs of the dysfunction or toxicity I had experienced in some of my college internships. If anything, the atmosphere was almost too quiet, too controlled. But I interpreted this as a sign of professionalism rather than suppression. During my second week, Mr. Hendricks began giving me special assignments that required me to work more closely with him. "I'm starting to give you access to more sensitive projects, Sarah," he explained, as he handed me a confidential client file. "This shows how much I trust you and believe in your potential. Not everyone gets this level of responsibility." So early in their tenure here, the trust felt like a privilege, and I was determined to prove myself worthy of his confidence. These special projects often required me to stay late, sometimes until 7 or 8 in the evening when the rest of the office had already gone home. Mr. Hendricks would order dinner for us and we would work side by side, reviewing client strategies and preparing presentations. During these evening sessions, our conversations became more personal. He would ask about my background, my goals, my fears about the future, and he shared stories about his own journey to success. "You remind me of myself when I was starting out," he told me one evening as we worked on a particularly complex client proposal. "Hungry, ambitious, willing to put in the extra effort to succeed. That's rare in young people today." His approval meant everything to me, especially given my recent struggles with unemployment and self-doubt. I felt like I had finally found someone who saw my potential and was willing to invest in developing it. It was during my third week that Mr. Hendricks first sent me to the basement alone. "I need you to retrieve the Henderson Industries file from 2019, he said, handing me the key to the basement door. "It's in cabinet C14, about halfway back. Take your time and make sure you get the complete file. We'll need everything for tomorrow's client meeting." The task seemed routine enough, though I remembered feeling slightly uneasy about going down there by myself. The basement felt different when I was alone. The fluorescent light seemed dimmer, casting longer shadows. Between the filing cabinets and storage boxes, the concrete walls made every sound echo, from my footsteps to the rustling of papers as I searched through the files. There was no cell phone reception down there, which made me feel completely cut off from the world above. I found myself working quickly, eager to return to the main office level. As I searched through the filing cabinets, I couldn't help but notice how extensive the archive was. There were files dating back over a decade, representing hundreds of clients and thousands of hours of work. The organization was meticulous, with everything labeled and sorted according to a complex system that Mr. Hendricks had obviously developed over many years. It was impressive, but also somehow overwhelming in its scope and detail. When I returned upstairs with the requested file, Mr. Hendricks seemed pleased with my efficiency. "Excellent work, Sarah. I can always count on you to handle these tasks thoroughly and professionally." His praise reinforced my sense that I was making a good impression in building the kind of relationship with my boss that could lead to rapid career advancement. I had no idea that this first solo trip to the basement was actually a test of my compliance and familiarity with the space that would later become my prison. The pattern continued over the following weeks. Mr. Hendricks would send me to the basement for various files and supplies, always with detailed instructions and always alone. "This is sensitive material," he would explain, "and I trust you to handle it appropriately. Not everyone has access to our archives." Each trip became more routine, and I grew comfortable navigating the maze of filing cabinets and storage areas. In the dim light during my 4th week, I began to notice subtle changes in the office dynamics. The other employees seemed to be interacting with me even less than before, often stopping conversations when I approached or finding reasons to leave the break room when I entered. At first, I worried that I had somehow offended them, but when I asked Jessica if everything was okay, she just smiled tightly and said, "Everything's fine. Sarah, just focus on your work." Mr. Hendricks, on the other hand, seemed increasingly pleased with my performance. He began including me in client meetings, asking me to prepare reports that would be presented to senior executives, and even hinting at possible promotion opportunities. "In the near future, you're exceeding all my expectations, Sarah," he told me during one of our evening work sessions. "I think you have real leadership potential. We might need to start thinking about expanding your responsibilities." The praise was intoxicating, especially after months of rejection and self-doubt. I threw myself into my work with renewed energy, staying late without being asked, volunteering for additional projects, and constantly seeking ways to prove my value to the company. Mr. Hendricks' approval had become the most important thing in my professional life, and I was willing to do almost anything to maintain it. Looking back now, I can see how carefully orchestrated those first few weeks were. Mr. Hendricks was systematically building my dependence on his approval, while simultaneously isolating me from potential allies in the office. He was teaching me to be comfortable in the basement, conditioning me to accept increasingly irregular working conditions, and establishing patterns of behavior that would later make his ultimate betrayal possible. But at the time, I felt nothing but gratitude and excitement. I thought I had found the perfect job with the perfect mentor, and I was determined to prove myself worthy of the opportunity. I had no idea that every day I spent in that office was bringing me closer to the nightmare that would change my life forever. I was walking willingly into a trap, and the man I trusted most was the one setting the snare. The honeymoon period was almost over, though I didn't know it yet. Soon, the mask would begin to slip, and the real Robert Hendricks would start to emerge. But for those first few weeks, I was the happiest I had been in months, completely unaware that my apparent good fortune was actually the opening chapter of the most terrifying experience of my life. By the start of my 2nd month at Mitchell & Associates, the honeymoon period began to show subtle cracks that I should have recognized as warning signs. Mr. Hendricks' behavior started shifting in ways that were almost imperceptible at first. A slight edge to his voice when giving instructions, a tendency to hover over my shoulder while I worked, and an increasing number of questions about my personal life that felt more invasive than friendly. When I mentioned having coffee with a college friend who was visiting town, his expression darkened momentarily before he forced a smile and said, "Just remember that building relationships here should be your priority right now." The isolation from my coworkers became more pronounced and deliberate. During my lunch breaks, I would try to join conversations in the break room, but they would quickly dissolve into awkward silence. Jessica, who had initially seemed sympathetic, now avoided eye contact entirely and would find excuses to leave whenever I approached. Mark had taken to eating lunch at his desk rather than risk encountering me in the common areas. When I finally worked up the courage to ask Jessica directly if I had done something wrong, she glanced nervously toward Mr. Hendricks' office and whispered, "It's not you, Sarah. It's just safer this way." Mr. Hendricks' monitoring of my activities intensified dramatically. He would appear at my desk without warning to check my computer screen, asking detailed questions about emails I was writing or websites I was browsing. He installed software that tracked my internet usage and began reviewing my phone calls, both incoming and outgoing. "I'm not trying to spy on you, Sarah," he explained when I hesitantly questioned the new oversight. "I'm protecting you from making rookie mistakes that could damage your reputation. Trust me, this level of guidance is what separates successful people from those who struggle." The requests for overtime became more frequent and less optional. What had initially been presented as special opportunities to work on important projects evolved into unspoken expectations that I would stay late whenever Mr. Hendricks deemed it necessary. The overtime was still unpaid, but when I gently brought this up, he responded with a lecture about investing in your future and paying your dues. He made it clear that questioning his policies was a sign of ingratitude and lack of commitment to my career development. My trips to the basement became more frequent and began to follow a disturbing pattern. Mr. Hendricks would send me down there during the busiest parts of the day, when other employees were most likely to be distracted by their own work. The tasks he assigned, organizing files, taking inventory of supplies, retrieving archived documents, always seemed to take longer than expected, keeping me isolated in that cold, windowless space for hours at a time. He would lock the door behind me for security purposes and unlock it when I knocked, to signal that I was finished. The psychological pressure manifested in increasingly creative ways. Mr. Hendricks would give me assignments with impossible deadlines, then express disappointment when I couldn't complete them to his satisfaction. He would change project requirements without notice, making my previous work obsolete and forcing me to start over. When I made minor mistakes, the kind that any new employee might make, he would call special meetings to discuss my concerning pattern of errors and question whether I was truly committed to excellence. Sleep became elusive as the stress mounted. I would lie awake at night replaying interactions with Mr. Hendricks, trying to figure out what I had done wrong and how I could improve. My appetite decreased, and I found myself constantly on edge, never knowing whether I would encounter the supportive mentor or the critical taskmaster when I walked into the office each morning. The unpredictability was exhausting, but I convinced myself that this was just part of the learning process in a demanding professional environment. The final warning sign came during a particularly intense feedback session in Mr. Hendricks' office. He spent 20 minutes detailing my shortcomings, questioning my intelligence, and suggesting that perhaps I wasn't cut out for the consulting industry after all. Then, without warning, his demeanor completely shifted. He smiled warmly, put his hand on my shoulder and said, "But I still believe in you, Sarah. That's why I'm willing to invest so much time and energy in your development. Most bosses would have given up on you by now." The emotional whiplash was devastating and left me feeling completely dependent on his approval. When I tried to confide in my parents about the increasingly stressful work environment, they dismissed my concerns as typical adjustment challenges for a new graduate. "Every job is difficult at first," my father said. "You need to prove yourself before you can expect to be treated like a valued employee." Even my college friends, when I managed to connect with them, seemed to think I was overreacting to normal workplace pressures. The isolation was becoming complete. No one understood what I was experiencing, and I was starting to doubt my own perceptions. Looking back, I realized that this period was the final phase of Mr. Hendricks' grooming process. He had successfully isolated me from support systems, established complete control over my work environment, conditioned me to accept increasingly inappropriate treatment, and made me psychologically dependent on his approval. I was primed for the final stage of his plan, though I had no idea what was coming. All I knew was that I felt trapped in a job I couldn't afford to lose, working for a man whose behavior was becoming more frightening with each passing day. The stage was set for the nightmare that would begin just 2 weeks later. The psychological warfare intensified during my third month as Mr. Hendricks seemed to take pleasure in keeping me constantly off balance and unsure of my standing in the company. His mood swings became more extreme and unpredictable. One moment he would be praising my dedication and promising rapid advancement. The next he would be questioning my basic competence and suggesting that hiring me had been a mistake. The emotional whiplash was designed to break down my confidence and make me desperately crave his approval. A strategy that was working better than I wanted to admit. His micromanagement reached levels that bordered on harassment. He would stand directly behind my chair while I worked, breathing down my neck and critiquing every keystroke. He monitored my bathroom breaks, timed my lunch periods down to the minute, and required detailed explanations for any deviation from my assigned tasks. When I received a personal phone call from my dentist's office confirming an appointment, he demanded to know who had called and why, then lectured me about maintaining professional boundaries during work hours. The basement assignments became more frequent and more isolating. What had once been occasional trips to retrieve specific files evolved into daily sessions of archive organization that kept me underground for 3 to 4 hours at a stretch. Mr. Hendricks would personally escort me to the basement door, lock it behind me with his keyring, and leave me alone in that cold, concrete space with vague instructions to reorganize the filing system or conduct a complete inventory of supplies. The isolation was suffocating, and I began to dread the sound of his footsteps approaching my desk. The other employees had completely withdrawn from any interaction with me, creating an atmosphere of toxic silence whenever I was present. During staff meetings, they would avoid eye contact and speak only when directly addressed by Mr. Hendricks. Jessica, who had once offered friendly smiles and small talk, now treated me as if I were invisible. Mark would literally leave the room if I entered, mumbling about forgotten tasks that suddenly required his immediate attention. The message was clear: associating with me was dangerous for their own job security. My work assignments became increasingly impossible and contradictory. Mr. Hendricks would give me a project with specific parameters, then change the requirements daily while maintaining the same deadline. He would assign me tasks that required information he hadn't provided, then express disappointment when I asked for clarification. When I worked late to meet his expectations, he would criticize me for being inefficient. When I tried to work more efficiently during regular hours, he would accuse me of cutting corners and compromising quality. The financial pressure was deliberately weaponized against me. Despite my salary being higher than I had expected, Mr. Hendricks began finding reasons to dock my pay for minor infractions, arriving 5 minutes late, taking a lunch break that ran over by 10 minutes, or making what he deemed careless errors in my work. He implemented a complex system of fines and penalties that ate away at my income while maintaining plausible deniability about the true purpose of these deductions. I was making less money than when I started, but I was afraid to complain. Sleep deprivation became a constant companion as the stress manifested in chronic insomnia. I would lie awake replaying conversations with Mr. Hendricks, trying to decode his increasingly cryptic feedback and prepare for the next day's inevitable confrontations. My physical health began to deteriorate. I lost weight, developed persistent headaches, and found myself constantly fighting off minor illnesses that my compromised immune system couldn't handle. The person I saw in the mirror looked hollow-eyed and defeated. The gaslighting reached new heights of sophistication as Mr. Hendricks began rewriting history to suit his narrative. He would deny conversations we had clearly had, claim that instructions he had given me were different from what I remembered, and insist that my emotional responses to his behavior were evidence of my professional immaturity. "I'm concerned about your ability to handle constructive criticism, Sarah," he would say. After reducing me to tears with his verbal attacks, successful people don't take feedback personally. My social isolation became complete as Mr. Hendricks actively discouraged me from maintaining relationships outside of work. When I mentioned plans to meet friends for dinner, he would suddenly assign urgent projects that required me to work late. When I received texts or phone calls during the day, he would make pointed comments about my divided attention and lack of focus. He convinced me that my dedication to the job should take precedence over all other relationships and activities. The final escalation came when Mr. Hendricks began making veiled threats about my future employment. He would mention how difficult it was for young professionals to find good jobs in the current market, how negative references could destroy a career before it started, and how disappointed he would be if he couldn't recommend me to future employers. The implication was clear. Crossing him would not only cost me this job, but potentially any future opportunities in my field. I felt completely trapped, psychologically and financially dependent on a man who seemed to take pleasure in my suffering, with no way out that wouldn't destroy my career prospects forever. The incident that marked the beginning of the end happened on a Thursday morning in late September, when I made what should have been a minor, easily correctable mistake on a client presentation. I had been working on a quarterly analysis report for Henderson Industries, one of our largest accounts, and in my exhaustion from another sleepless night, I had transposed two numbers in a financial projection. The error changed a growth forecast from 3.2% to 2.3%, a small discrepancy. That would have taken 30 seconds to fix and would have had no impact on the overall strategic recommendations. But when Mr. Hendricks discovered the mistake during his morning review of my work, his reaction was so explosive and disproportionate that it caught the attention of everyone in the office. His face turned a deep shade of red and his hands were visibly shaking as he held the offending document. "Sarah," he bellowed from his office, his voice carrying through the thin walls with such force that I could see my coworkers flinch at their desks. "Get in here immediately." The tone left no room for misunderstanding. This was not going to be a constructive feedback session. I walked into his office on unsteady legs, my heart already racing from the adrenaline surge. His shout had triggered. He was standing behind his desk, the presentation materials scattered across the surface as if he had thrown them there in his rage. His gray eyes were cold and focused like a predator sizing up its prey. "Do you see this?" he demanded, jabbing his finger at the page containing the error. "Do you have any idea what you've done? This kind of carelessness could cost us one of our most important clients." The verbal assault that followed was unlike anything I had experienced in my life. Mr. Hendricks questioned my intelligence, my work ethic, my basic competence as a human being, and my right to call myself a professional. He accused me of being lazy, careless, and fundamentally unsuited for the business world. He suggested that hiring me had been the biggest mistake of his career and that my presence at the company was actively damaging the reputation he had spent decades building. Every word felt like a physical blow. "I trusted you with this project, Sarah," he continued, his voice rising to a near shout. "I put my personal reputation on the line by giving you access to our most important clients, and this is how you repay me, with sloppy, amateur hour work that makes us all look like incompetents." He picked up the presentation and waved it in my face, close enough that I could feel the air movement from his gestures. The humiliation was crushing, made worse by the knowledge that everyone in the office could hear every word of his tirade. Through the glass wall of his office, I could see my coworkers pretending to be absorbed in their work while obviously listening. To every word of my public destruction, Jessica was staring intently at her computer screen, but her hands weren't moving on the keyboard. Mark had his phone pressed to his ear, but I could tell he wasn't actually speaking to anyone. Lisa, the receptionist, was shuffling papers with unnecessary intensity, clearly uncomfortable with the scene playing out just feet away from her desk. When I tried to apologize and offer to correct the mistake immediately, Mr. Hendricks cut me off with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Apologies don't fix the damage, Sarah. Sorry, doesn't restore the confidence our clients have in our work. This isn't just about one number. It's about a pattern of carelessness and lack of attention to detail that calls into question everything you've produced for this company." His words were calculated to maximize my shame and self-doubt, and they were devastatingly effective. The aftermath of this incident marked a clear turning point in our relationship. For the rest of that day, Mr. Hendricks treated me with cold professionalism, speaking to me only when absolutely necessary and responding to my attempts at normal workplace interaction with curt, dismissive replies. The other employees, already distant, now seemed actively afraid to be seen talking to me. I ate lunch alone at my desk, feeling like a pariah in what had once felt like a promising work environment. That evening, I found myself working late again, not because Mr. Hendricks had explicitly asked me to stay, but because I was desperate to prove that the morning's mistake didn't represent my true capabilities. I revised the Henderson Industries presentation 3 times, double-checked every number, and prepared additional analysis that hadn't been requested. I was determined to show him that I could be the employee he had initially believed I could become, that his faith in me hadn't been completely misplaced. When I finally presented the corrected work to Mr. Hendricks the next morning, his response was lukewarm at best. "This is what the work should have looked like yesterday, Sarah," he said without looking up from the documents. "Meeting basic standards isn't something to be celebrated, it's the minimum expectation for anyone in this profession." There was no acknowledgement of the extra effort I had put in. No recognition of the fact that the revised presentation was actually better than what had originally been requested. The goalposts had been moved, and I was learning that satisfying him was an impossible task. The morning that would change my life forever started like any other Tuesday in late October, with me arriving at the office 15 minutes early. Despite having gotten only 3 hours of sleep the night before, I had been lying awake, obsessing over a budget analysis report that was due that day, running through calculations in my head and second-guessing every decision I had made in preparing it. The chronic anxiety that had become my constant companion was reaching new heights, and I could feel the physical toll it was taking on my body in the form of persistent headaches and a stomach that seemed to be permanently tied in knots. The report in question was a quarterly budget projection for Morrison Tech, one of our mid-sized clients, and I had spent the better part of 3 days working on it. The challenge was that Mr. Hendricks had given me preliminary figures during a brief conversation the previous Friday, but when I had asked him to email me the specific numbers so I could reference them while working, he had brushed off my request. With an impatient wave, "Just use what I told you," he had said. "If you were paying attention during our meeting, you should have everything you need." Working from my handwritten notes in memory, I had compiled what I believed was an accurate and comprehensive analysis. The numbers seemed reasonable, the projections were conservative, and the recommendations were based on solid research I had conducted about Morrison Tech's industry trends. I had even created additional charts and graphs that weren't specifically requested, hoping to demonstrate my initiative and attention to detail. As I reviewed the final document one last time before printing it that Tuesday morning, I felt cautiously optimistic that this might be the work that would finally earn Mr. Hendricks' approval. That optimism was shattered at exactly 10:47 a.m. when Mr. Hendricks' voice cut through the quiet office like a knife. "Sarah, my office. Now?" The tone was sharper than usual, with an edge of barely controlled fury that made my blood run cold. I could feel the familiar surge of adrenaline and dread as I saved my work and walked toward his office, trying to prepare myself for whatever criticism awaited me. The other employees kept their eyes glued to their computer screens, but I could sense their tension as they anticipated another public humiliation. Mr. Hendricks was standing behind his desk when I entered, my budget report spread out before him like evidence at a crime scene. His face was flushed with anger, and his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "Can you explain to me," he said, his voice deadly quiet, "why the projected expenses for Q4 are completely different from the figures we discussed?" I felt my stomach drop as I realized that somewhere in the process, there had been a miscommunication about the baseline numbers I was supposed to use. "I used the figures you gave me on Friday," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. "If there were updated numbers, I didn't receive them." The words had barely left my mouth when I realized I had made a critical error. Mr. Hendricks' face went from red to purple, and his eyes narrowed with a rage that seemed completely out of proportion to the situation. I had challenged his version of events, and, in his mind, that was tantamount to calling him a liar. "Don't you dare try to blame this on me," he exploded, slamming both hands down on his desk so hard that his coffee mug jumped and spilled across the surface. "I sent you an email with the correct figures on Sunday evening. If you had bothered to check your work email like a professional should, instead of whatever it is you do with your weekends, you would have seen the updated numbers." I fumbled for my phone, desperately scrolling through my emails from the weekend, but there was nothing from him on Sunday, or any day that weekend. The verbal assault that followed was the most vicious I had yet experienced. Mr. Hendricks questioned not just my professional competence, but my basic intelligence and worth as a human being. He called me lazy, incompetent, ungrateful, and suggested that I was actively sabotaging the company with my carelessness. "This is exactly the kind of amateur, half-assed work that could destroy everything I've built here," he screamed, his voice echoing through the office loud enough that I was certain people in neighboring buildings could hear him. "I've wasted months trying to turn you into something resembling a professional," he continued, pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. "I've invested time, money, and my personal reputation in your development, and this is how you repay me? With work that's so sloppy and unreliable that I can't trust you with the simplest tasks." Each word felt like a physical blow, and I could feel tears forming in my eyes despite my desperate attempts to maintain some semblance of professional composure. When he finally paused his tirade, I whispered an apology and offered to correct the report immediately, but my words only seemed to inflame his rage further. "Sorry doesn't restore the confidence our clients have in our work. You need to learn that there are serious consequences for this kind of failure." The way he emphasized the word consequences sent a chill down my spine, and I had the distinct feeling that I was about to discover what he meant by that ominous statement. The sound of that basement door locking behind me will haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a heavy metallic click that seemed to echo through the concrete walls, followed by the unmistakable scrape of Mr. Hendricks' footsteps, moving away from the door and back up the stairs. For several minutes I stood frozen at the bottom of the steps, staring up at the closed door and trying to process what had just happened. This had to be another one of his psychological games, I told myself. Surely he would be back within an hour or two to let me out and lecture me about the importance of paying attention to detail. The first few hours passed in a haze of disbelief and forced productivity, organizing files with an intensity born of desperation and denial. Every folder I sorted, every document I filed alphabetically, was evidence that I was complying with his instructions and deserving of release. I kept glancing at my watch, expecting to hear his footsteps on the stairs above, the familiar sounds of the workday winding down, chairs being pushed back from desks, computers being shut down, and the muffled conversations of people preparing to go home. My heart rate increased as I listened for Mr. Hendricks' voice, for some indication that he was preparing to unlock the door and end this nightmare. Instead, the sounds gradually faded away until the building fell into the ominous silence that meant everyone had left for the day. I ran up the concrete steps and pounded on the door with both fists, calling out Mr. Hendricks. "Hello, I think everyone's gone home." To hear me? I tried the door handle frantically, though I knew it would be locked, then searched my pockets for my cell phone, only to remember that there was no signal in the basement's thick-walled bunker. Panic set in as the full scope of my situation became clear. I was locked in an underground room with no windows, no second exit, no phone service, and no way to contact the outside world. The temperature was already dropping as the building's heating system shut down for the night, and I had nothing but the light cardigan I had worn to work. There was a small utility sink in one corner that provided water, but no food, no blanket. Somehow, the shadows cast by the single overhead light seemed to move and shift, creating the illusion of movement in my peripheral vision. Every small sound was amplified in the concrete space: the drip of a faucet, the settling of the building, the distant rumble of traffic on the street above. I found myself jumping at every noise, my nerves already frayed from months of psychological pressure and now pushed to the breaking point by genuine fear. As night fell outside, though I couldn't see it through the windowless walls, the basement became my entire world. I tried to maintain some sense of normalcy by continuing to organize files, but my hands were shaking too badly to be effective. Would return in the morning that this was just an extreme version of his usual psychological games, but a growing voice in the back of my head whispered that something had fundamentally changed. That I was no longer dealing with workplace harassment, but with something much more dangerous. The first night was the longest of my life. I huddled in the corner near the utility sink, wrapped in my thin cardigan, trying to stay warm as the temperature continued to drop. Racing, I found myself straining to hear any sound from above, hoping for the creak of footsteps or the rattle of keys that would signal rescue. But the building remained silent as a tomb. By morning, when pale light began to filter through the crack under the door, I had convinced myself that my nightmare would be over soon. Surely Mr. Hendricks would arrive early, as he always did, unlock the door, and pretend that this had all been a valuable lesson in responsibility. I positioned myself near the bottom of the stairs, ready to demonstrate that I had learned whatever lesson he intended to teach. But as the hours passed and the building filled with the sounds of another workday beginning, no one came for me. The horrible truth began to sink in during that second day. This wasn't a punishment that would end with an apology and a promise to do better. This was something else entirely, something planned and deliberate and terrifyingly open-ended. Mr. Hendricks had crossed a line from psychological abuse into false imprisonment, and I was completely at his mercy in a place where no one could hear me scream. The man I had once trusted with my career had become my captor, and I was trapped in a concrete box with no idea when or if he planned to let me out alive. By the third day of my imprisonment, survival instincts I never knew I possessed began to take over. The initial panic and disbelief had given way to a grim determination to stay alive. No matter how long Mr. Hendricks planned to keep me trapped in his concrete tomb, when absolutely necessary and trying to ignore the growing hunger that gnawed at my stomach like a living thing, the basement became my entire universe. And I began to explore every inch of it with the desperate thoroughness of someone whose life might depend on finding something, anything that could help me escape or survive. Hidden behind stacks of old filing cabinets, I discovered boxes of documents that shouldn't have been there. Employee personnel files dating back years, including detailed psychological profiles and what appeared to be surveillance reports on former workers. The more I read, the more I realized that I wasn't Mr. Hendricks' first victim. Among the hidden files, I found records of at least 6 other young women who had worked for Mitchell and Associates over the past decade. Each file contained photographs, personal information, behavioral observations, and chillingly detailed notes about their progress under Mr. Hendricks' control. Most disturbing were the final entries in each file: abrupt terminations, with notes like subject became non-compliant or elimination necessary. The implications made my blood run cold, and I understood that my situation was far more dangerous than I had initially realized. I also discovered a cache of surveillance equipment hidden behind false walls in the basement: cameras, recording devices, and monitoring equipment that had obviously been used to spy on employees without their knowledge. There were dozens of photographs of me taken without my consent, at my desk, in the break room, even in the bathroom. The violation was overwhelming, but it also provided me with evidence of his crimes. Physical challenges of survival became more pressing with each passing day. The cold concrete floor made sleep nearly impossible, and the thin cardigan that had seemed adequate for office temperature provided. I learned to exercise constantly to maintain body temperature. Doing jumping jacks and push-ups in the narrow spaces between filing cabinets, the hunger was becoming debilitating, and I found myself growing weaker as my body began to consume its own muscle mass for energy. My psychological state fluctuated wildly between determination and despair. During my strongest moments, I would continue exploring the basement, documenting evidence, and planning ways to escape or signal for help. But in my weakest hours, usually during the long nights when the building was silent and my situation seemed hopeless, I would break down completely, sobbing uncontrollably and wondering if anyone would ever find my body. The isolation was as brutal as the physical deprivation, and I found myself talking to myself just to hear a human voice. On the fourth day, I made a discovery that changed everything. A section of the basement wall that sounded hollow when I tapped on it. Using tools I had found in the maintenance area, I managed to pry away a false panel to reveal a hidden room that contained Mr. Hendricks' true operations. Inside were computers, files, and evidence of a systematic pattern of abuse that had been going on for years. I found video recordings of his sessions with previous employees, financial records showing how he had been embezzling from clients, and most shocking of all, documentation of what had happened to the women who had disappeared from his employment. The hidden room also contained supplies that probably saved my life. Energy bars, bottled water. The food was stale, but edible, and for the first time in days, outside world, but when I tried to use it, I discovered that it required a security code to make outgoing calls. Among Mr. Hendricks' personal effects in the hidden room, I found a journal that detailed his methods and motivations with chilling clarity. He wrote about his employees like specimens in a psychological experiment, imprisonment from the moment he hired me, viewing me as his most promising subject for what he called his ultimate stress test. By the fifth day, armed with evidence of his crimes and a growing understanding of his psychology, I began to formulate a plan for escape. The journal had revealed that he typically checked on his subjects every few days to monitor their condition and collect data for his twisted research. If I could time my actions correctly, I might be able to turn the tables on him when he next entered the basement. Hendricks would face justice for his crimes. My chance came on the morning of the sixth day when I heard the familiar sound of Mr. Hendricks. I had positioned myself behind a tall filing cabinet near the entrance, clutching a heavy metal flashlight I had found in the hidden room, the closest thing to a weapon I could find in my concrete prison. My heart was pounding so loudly I was certain he would hear it, but I forced myself to remain perfectly still as his footsteps grew closer. When the basement door swung open, surveyed what he expected to be a broken and defeated victim. "Well, Sarah," he said conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather, "I trust you've had time to reflect on the importance of following instructions precisely." He carried a small notebook and pen, apparently planning to document my condition as part of his sick research project. As he moved deeper into the basement, looking for me among the filing cabinets, I realized this might be my only opportunity. To catch him off guard, every instinct screamed at me to attack, but I forced myself to wait until he was completely turned away from the exit. When he finally moved to check the utility sink area where I had spent most of my time, enough to knock him unconscious, but it stunned him long enough for me to grab his keyring and sprint for the stairs. He recovered quickly and lunged after me, his hand closing around my ankle just as I reached the bottom step. "You ungrateful little bitch," he snarled, his mask of professional civility completely gone now. "After everything I've done for your development, this is how you repay me." His grip was strong, but desperation gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. I kicked backward with my free foot, connecting with his face and hearing the satisfying crunch of his nose breaking. His grip loosened just enough for me to wrench free and scramble up the concrete steps, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key into the lock. Behind me, I could hear him getting to his feet, cursing and promising to make me pay for my ingratitude. The lock finally turned, and I burst through the door into the main office just as his footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. The office was empty. It was still early morning, before the other employees typically arrived, but I didn't stop running until I was outside the building and on the sidewalk, gulping the fresh air like a drowning person breaking the surface. My legs were weak from days of malnutrition and stress, and I collapsed on the pavement just as a jogger rounded the corner. The woman took one look at my disheveled appearance and immediately called 911, staying with me until the police and ambulance arrived. The next few hours passed in a blur of medical examinations, police interviews, and the overwhelming relief of being surrounded by people who believed my story and were taking immediate action. The responding officers arrested Mr. Hendricks at the scene, finding him in the basement trying to destroy evidence from the hidden room I had discovered. Evidence I had helped them uncover. The paramedics who examined me were shocked by my condition: severe dehydration, malnutrition, and signs of prolonged psychological trauma that would take months to fully address. But I was alive, and more importantly, I had escaped with evidence that would ensure Mr. Hendricks faced justice for his crimes. A clear picture of systematic abuse that had been going on for years at the hospital. As doctors treated my physical injuries and social workers began the process of connecting me with psychological support services, I finally allowed myself to process what I had survived. The nightmare was over, but I knew the real work of healing was just beginning. I had escaped Robert Hendricks' concrete prison, but the psychological chains he had forged would take much longer to break. The most difficult part was calling my parents to explain what had happened. Their shock and guilt over dismissing my earlier concerns about the job was palpable, and for the first time in months, I felt truly supported by the people who were supposed to care about me, bringing the emotional support I had been desperately lacking during those terrible months of isolation and abuse. The legal proceedings that followed my escape moved faster than I had expected, largely due to the overwhelming evidence we had uncovered in Mr. Hendricks' hidden basement operation. Within 48 hours of my rescue, police had executed search warrants on his home and personal storage units, discovering even more damning evidence of his systematic pattern of abuse and financial crimes. The district attorney assigned to the case, Maria Santos, was a seasoned prosecutor who specialized in workplace violence and seemed personally invested in ensuring that justice was served. The evidence against Robert Hendricks was so extensive that his defense attorney advised him to consider a plea bargain, but his arrogance prevented him from accepting responsibility for his crimes. During his arraignment, he maintained his innocence and claimed that I was a disgruntled employee who had fabricated the entire story after being terminated for poor performance. His calm, professional demeanor in the courtroom was chilling, the same mask of respectability he had worn during my interview months earlier. Jessica and Mark, my former co-workers, came forward once they learned about the investigation, revealing that they had suspected something terrible was happening but had been too terrified to speak up. Their testimony painted a picture of a workplace ruled by fear, where employees lived in constant terror of becoming Mr. Hendricks' next target. Jessica broke down on the witness stand as she described watching him isolate and torment a succession of young women over the years, always feeling helpless to intervene. The trial lasted 3 weeks, during which the prosecution methodically presented evidence of false imprisonment, assault, embezzlement, stalking, and a dozen other charges. The most powerful moment came when they played recordings from Mr. Hendricks' own surveillance equipment, including audio of him planning my imprisonment and discussing his previous subjects with clinical detachment. The jury visibly recoiled as they listened to his voice describing the psychological techniques he used to break down his victims. My testimony was the most difficult thing I had ever done, but it was also empowering in a way I hadn't expected. For months, Mr. Hendricks had controlled my reality, making me doubt my own perceptions and question my worth as a human being. Standing in that courtroom and telling my story to a judge and jury who believed me was a crucial step in reclaiming my voice and my sense of self. When his defense attorney tried to suggest that I had somehow invited or deserved the treatment I received, I was able to respond with clarity and strength that surprised even me. The prosecution also presented evidence linking Mr. Hendricks to the disappearances of 2 former employees whose cases had previously been classified as voluntary departures. While they couldn't prove definitively what had happened to these women, the evidence suggested that my escape may have prevented me from becoming his next murder victim. The judge allowed this evidence to be presented as part of establishing a pattern of escalating violence that made my case even more serious. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. When the foreman read the verdict, Mr. Hendricks' mask finally slipped completely. His face went pale, and for the first time since I had known him, he appeared genuinely shaken. The man who had wielded absolute power over my life was finally being held accountable for his actions, and the relief I felt was overwhelming. During the sentencing hearing, I was given the opportunity to deliver a victim impact statement. I had prepared extensively for this moment, and I used it not only to describe the lasting effects of his abuse, but also to speak for the other victims who hadn't survived to tell their stories. "You tried to destroy my sense of self-worth and my faith in other people," I told him, looking directly into his eyes for the first time since my escape. "But you failed. I survived, and I will use my voice to make sure no one else suffers the way I did." Judge Patricia Williams sentenced Robert Hendricks to 25 years to life in prison, with the possibility of parole only after serving the full 25 years. She stated that his crimes represented a particularly heinous abuse of power and trust, and that his complete lack of remorse made him an ongoing danger to society. As the bailiff led him away in handcuffs, he turned to look at me one last time, and I saw not the intimidating predator who had terrorized me, but a pathetic, broken man who had finally been stripped of the power he had used to hurt innocent people. The conviction made headlines in local newspapers and business journals, serving as a warning to other potential predators and hopefully encouraging victims of workplace abuse to come forward. Several other women contacted law enforcement after seeing the news coverage, reporting similar experiences with other employers that had previously gone unreported. My case had become part of a larger conversation about power dynamics in the workplace and the importance of creating safe channels for reporting abuse. The months following Mr. Hendricks' conviction were a complex journey of healing that required patience, professional support, and the gradual rebuilding of my shattered sense of security. The trauma didn't end when he was led away in handcuffs. In many ways, that was when the real work of recovery began. I started seeing Dr. Patricia Chen, a therapist who specialized in helping survivors of prolonged psychological abuse, and through her guidance, I slowly began to understand how thoroughly my sense of reality had been manipulated during those terrible months. The physical recovery was the easiest part. Within weeks of proper nutrition and medical care, my body began to heal from the effects of those 5 days in captivity. But the psychological scars ran much deeper, affecting my ability to trust my own judgment and form healthy relationships with authority figures. Simple things like job interviews or performance reviews would trigger panic attacks that transported me back to that basement. Dr. Chen helped me develop coping strategies and gradually rebuild my confidence in my own perceptions and abilities. One of the most important aspects of my healing journey was connecting with other survivors of workplace abuse. Through a support group facilitated by the local victim services organization, I met women who had experienced similar patterns of manipulation and control in their professional lives. Sharing our stories and supporting each other's recovery was incredibly powerful, and it helped me understand that what happened to me was part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior that affects thousands of workers every year. The legal victory also led to significant changes in workplace safety legislation in our state. The evidence uncovered during Mr. Hendricks' trial sparked a legislative review of employment law that resulted in stronger protections for workers and more severe penalties for employers who abuse their power. I was invited to testify before the state legislature about the need for better reporting mechanisms and support services for victims of workplace abuse, turning my traumatic experience into advocacy that could help protect others financially. The civil lawsuit against Mr. Hendricks and his company resulted in a settlement that provided me with the resources I needed for long-term therapy and career rehabilitation. More importantly, it forced the closure of Mitchell and Associates and the implementation of oversight measures that would prevent similar operations from functioning without detection. The building where I was imprisoned was eventually demolished, which provided me with a symbolic sense of closure. My career path took an unexpected turn as a result of these experiences. Instead of pursuing the traditional business career I had originally planned, I decided to study law with a focus on employment rights and victim advocacy. The same attention to detail and analytical skills that Mr. Hendricks had tried to destroy became the foundation for a new career dedicated to helping other victims seek justice. 3 years after my escape, I passed the bar exam and began working with a firm that specializes in workplace abuse cases. The most difficult aspect of moving forward was learning to trust my instincts again. Mr. Hendricks had been so skilled at gaslighting and manipulation that I had lost faith in my ability to accurately assess people and situations. Through therapy and the support of people who genuinely cared about my well-being, I gradually learned to recognize the difference between healthy professional relationships and the red flags that signal potential abuse. This process took years, but it was essential for my ability to function in the working world again. Looking back now, I can identify the warning signs that I missed or dismissed during those early months at Mitchell and Associates. The isolation from coworkers, the excessive personal interest in my private life, the unpredictable mood swings, the gradual escalation of controlling behavior. These are all common tactics used by workplace predators to groom their victims. If my story helps even one person recognize these patterns before it's too late, then sharing this painful experience will have been worthwhile for anyone who might be experiencing similar treatment in their workplace. I want you to know that your instincts are probably correct. If something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. If a boss or supervisor is making you feel isolated, confused, or constantly on edge, those are red flags that deserve serious attention. Trust your gut, document everything, and don't be afraid to reach out for help. There are people who will believe you and support you, even when it feels like you're completely alone today. 5 years after my escape from that basement, I can honestly say that I've not only survived Robert Hendricks' attempt to destroy me, I've thrived in spite of it. The experience changed me in ways both terrible and profound, but it also revealed reserves of strength and resilience I never knew I possessed. While I wouldn't wish this experience on anyone, it has given me a sense of purpose and a deep appreciation for the preciousness of freedom and safety that I might never have developed otherwise. Robert Hendricks remains in prison, where he will stay for the foreseeable future. Occasionally, I receive updates about his status through the victim notification system, but he has become increasingly irrelevant to my daily life. The man who once controlled every aspect of my existence is now just a memory, a cautionary tale that I share to help protect others from similar predators.